Welcome everyone as you come into the town hall. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, it's 6:30, so we're going to get started. I see 40 people are on right now. We're expecting about 100 altogether. Really excited for the resuming of our town halls on race and racism. This is the first one we've had since May. We had some other activities over the summer, and now it's so good to be together again. We're starting a series on religion and racism, and our topic tonight is to talk about the historical context. You see a list of task force members on the screen. I always need to start with a little bit of a warning. One of the town halls, one of our very early town halls, we were actually Zoom bombed. We do have security in place. We have Brian Wheeler acting as security. So if anybody shows up and is not engaged in a respectful conversation, we want to remove them as soon as possible. But it does take a few moments to make that happen. So I just need to give the warning ahead of time because this is a public meeting. There's no way we can be absolutely certain that nobody will enter that doesn't have good intentions. Again, this is the list of the Anti-Racism Task Force members. When you're out and about in the community, please thank them for their participation and interest in creating a more just community for everybody. These are some of the actions that we have taken over the past year. We formed a little over a year ago. We have a very active resource list on the task force webpage. Jane Stopker maintains that. So if you're looking for resources, that is an excellent place to go. Wes McGee is also a member of the task force, and he leads a community book club that you're more than welcome, invited to participate in. We also have added reflection and action buttons to that Racism Task Force page. So we encourage you as you're reading and studying or watching and reflecting to note your thoughts, to share your reflections, and also to record your actions so that we have an opportunity to share with each other what we are doing. We are supporting the county DEI initiatives, and on the page, there's also a place where you could click to sign a statement of support. We've created window clings. That's what you see on this slide. Everyone belongs in safe place, which are in houses and businesses throughout the community. And we've partnered with a long talk for those who want to go to the next step in these conversations and really want to develop skills for talking with family members and neighbors and others who might have very different perspectives. Another thing we did is we put together a video of the Grand Havens Diversity and Inclusion Statement. So we'll start our evening with that.
We want to share with you Grand Havens Diversity and Inclusion Statement, read by leaders and future leaders of our community.
The City of Grand Haven respects, values, and celebrates.
La ciudad de Grand Haven respeta, valora y celebra los atributos, características y perspectivas
that make people who they are.
Únicos, que hacen que las personas sean como son.
Pillars of inclusion, diversity, and equity.
Los pilares de equidad, diversidad e inclusión son vitales.
Are vital to a vibrant community.
Para una comunidad vibrante.
And we believe that bringing diverse individuals together,
urging all voices to be heard, allows us to build a stronger community.
Y creemos que unir a personas diversas y alentar a todas las voces a ser escuchadas nos permite construir una comunidad más fuerte.
The City of Grand Haven upholds these pillars.
La ciudad de Grand Haven defiende estos pilares como cruciales.
As crucial to healthy people in a healthier community.
Para mantener las personas saludables y una comunidad sana.
So we're very grateful for all of the people who participated in creating that video. And now to move into the reason we're here tonight, to talk about religion and racism in that historical context. We have three amazing panelists with us tonight. I'm so excited to hear from each of them. Rick Stevenson from the University of Florida, Victoria Proctor Gibbs, who leads Congregations Organizing for Racial Reconciliation, and Gordon Wiersma from Hope Church. This is how the evening's going to flow for those of you who are new. We have this welcome, we have a few instructions and an opening polling question. Then we hear from each of our panelists. That's followed by a Q&A opportunity. Then we go into our breakout sessions. We report out from the breakouts, have final polling, and then talk about our next steps. A few instructions. Please leave yourself on mute. Please mute yourself if you haven't already, and stay on mute unless you are speaking as a facilitator or one of our panelists. We ask that, or we are closed captioning this. So if you want to see the subtitles and you're not, you can click on the subtitles to be able to see them. We also will ask you to put your questions or your comments in the chat box. So you can click on the chat to add your comments or your questions. If you have questions for a specific speaker, if you would identify which speaker you want to answer, otherwise we'll randomly ask the speakers. In terms of the breakout sessions, you do need to have the Zoom app downloaded on your computer or your phone. You can't do that from the browser. So hopefully you've downloaded the app. We do ask that you leave your camera on, especially in the breakout sessions. It really does help facilitate a feeling of trust as we build relationships with each other if we can have the camera on. I know that there are exceptions sometimes that makes that really difficult, but if at all possible, please try to have your camera on and be really a physical part of the community. We will be taking next steps. We're recording the event tonight, and we will send that out to everybody who has registered, along with the PowerPoint and any other materials, any other questions. And then we will be reviewing this at the task force. We'll be debriefing. We'll be looking for action items that we can act on, and we'll be planning the next town hall. Finally, there are communication and guidelines and rules that we follow for every one of our conversations. The first one is honesty. We don't get together to debate who's right or wrong, but to be willing to listen to other people's honest experiences and feelings, to be willing to share our honest experience and feelings. It's not necessary that we agree at all times, but we don't want to get into a debate. We need to just be able to share our personal experience and listen to others. Equality, we do have amazing panelists here that are going to provide information and backdrop for us, but we're all equal and valuable contributors to the conversation. Respect, we all come with preconceived ideas, and they can get in the way of our listening to each other. So we want to be aware of that so we can remain respectful of others and ourselves at all times. We want to practice active listening. That doesn't come naturally in our society these days, and it's especially hard in Zoom. So we really want to challenge ourselves to be present and to listen to whoever is speaking rather than thinking about what we want to say. We want to take responsibility for our words and for our feelings. All of us have hot buttons, and they can get triggered unintentionally. So if it happens, we want to be able to name it without blaming somebody for it. And finally, we work hard to create a shame-free zone. This is a place where we want to be able to ask questions that maybe we're not always comfortable asking, where we want to share the things that we've been carrying around with us so that we can unpack them, look at them objectively, and decide whether we want to continue carrying them with us or not. And we can't do that in an atmosphere of shame. Shame doesn't lead to healthy change. It only pushes negative thoughts and behaviors further underground where they fester. So these are our ground rules tonight. If we were in person, I would ask for your agreement to the ground rules. Since we're not in person, I want to state that these will be the expectations. And if you think you'll be having difficulty following these rules, then this probably isn't the right time for you to be in this conversation. And you might want to leave now and join us again at a more appropriate time for yourself. So we have an initial polling question. Oh, that is the evaluation question, wrong one. Our pre-poll is actually two questions. The first is, how comfortable do you feel talking about race and racism? So as we begin this conversation, 1 being I have no confidence, and 10 being I am completely confident. If you would just choose 1 through 10. And then the second question is racism present in our community? Not at all, minimally, somewhat, regularly, or always, because the problem is systemic. If you would just answer those 2 questions, and once you answer them, you do have to hit the submit button for it to be recorded. So we'll just take a moment for this. And I see the votes are still coming in, so I'm going to let it kind of ride out as people continue to register. If you'd please answer both questions and make sure you hit the submit afterward. And we're about 85%. I'll go ahead and end this poll. You can see we do have some people who are not confident about having this conversation. 2, 3, 4, 5. Most people are at 8, and a few people at 10. Is racism present in our community? We have 10% saying somewhat, 18% regularly, and 73% noting that it's always present. And I just realized I did not hit the share button. So let me show these results to you. So we all know kind of where we're starting tonight. And now I want to introduce our first panelist. Each of our panelists will have 10 minutes. And at the end of all 3 of those speakers, we'll have the Q&A time. So as people are talking, feel free to enter questions in the chat box, and Mary Jane will facilitate that. So she will feed the questions to the speakers after they talk. And so we'll start with Rick. Whoops. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Rick, so that you can share yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara. How are you tonight?
Very good.
Good. Am I introducing myself, or we just gonna roll?
You can briefly introduce yourself and then roll.
Good. All right. Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Rick Stevenson. I am professor of African American Studies at the University of Florida. I also have degrees in biblical studies and theology. My PhD is in African and African American Studies, where I focus primarily on suicide by drowning as a form of resistance. After studying African traditional religions, specifically the Igbo and the Asante, one of the things I discovered was that there was a belief by some of these ethnic groups that if they died in the water, their spirit would go back to Africa. And we call that transmigration. If you saw the movie, The Black Panther, when the Black Panther dies, he ends up with his ancestors. And that's what we kind of call transmigration. So that's kind of what I do. I also teach courses in African American religion at the University of Florida, and I teach Black theological thought. So here is my presentation. I want to begin by saying that God is not a racist, nor is he sexist. And if we believe that the Bible is true and it is inerrant, then we must believe that when God sent his only son to die for the world, that his death was not conditioned on one's race. As a matter of fact, race as we know it is socially constructed, and there is no genetic nor hereditary component that makes one group of people superior to the other based on skin color. As a social construct, race has been defined differently by different racial groups. The construction of the Black body over time, however, has been fraught with societal, scientific, biological, and educational conceptions that permit or expose this individual group of people to racial epithets and discrimination. These racial ideas have challenged the humanity, the rights, and the socio-legal incorporation of Black persons in American society. That is one of the reasons why critical race theory has become such a dog whistle and a racialized boogeyman. One of the most frequent questions asked when it comes to human evolution is about biblical anthropology. Who are the real Jews? Now, that is a legit question. However, contextually, it is not answered in the scriptures. That's because when you and I ask a question or the question, we are normally seeking a racialized response. The Bible does not designate social status based on skin color, nor does it discriminate based on what you and I understand as racial segregation. So what we need then is an alternative analysis to a white supremacist biblical hermeneutic. The early days of African-American exegetical and hermeneutical analysis were taken up as early as 1915. There was a scholar by the name of Richard Morrissey who began looking at the scriptures and demonstrating through his research of the original text, which is very important, that there is no racial discrimination in the scriptures. As early as 1915, Dr. Morrissey, who was an AME Zion preacher and professor, scholar, said that if we really look at the scriptures from the original text, we will arrive at an alternative analysis of what God said when he was writing or using his scholars, his prophets to write the text. More recently, another Black linguist and New Testament scholar, Dr. Kane Hope Felder, also added to this legacy that disputes the numerous white supremacist interpretations of the biblical text. Dr. Felder says, and I argue, and I quote, "Throughout Western history, the authority of the Bible has been predicated upon the tacit assumption of the preeminence of European cultures as somehow the most suitable and thus the most reliable bearers of the tradition, a tradition that has been passed on and otherwise shared with the Americas and Asia. Especially in the modern period, the attitude developed that African Americans, Afro-Asiatics, Asians, and Hispanics were quite secondary to the ancient biblical narrative." He goes on to say that the Europeans and Euro-American church and the academy historically and unevenly struggled to speak and sometimes to write with a vision of universalism and inclusiveness. But actually the church and the academy thought and practiced particularity and exclusiveness without reference to the authority of what the biblical authors thought and what they did in the ancient text. Recent studies, however, help us to appreciate the biblical world as being, watch this, as one titled multi-ethnic before color prejudice. Now, if we were to look at the biblical text, and I'm talking specifically now, and I'm going to show my screen, Genesis chapter 2. We have a geographical location of where we think the Garden of Eden may have been. Verse 10 says, "A river flowed from the Garden of Eden, watering the garden, and then dividing into 4 branches. The first branch was the Pishon, followed by the flowed around the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is exceptionally pure. Aromatic resin and onyx stones are also there. The second branch is called the Gihon. It flows around the entire land of Cush. The third branch is called the Tigris, and which flows through the east of Ashur. And the fourth is called the Euphrates." Now, if I, there's a screen up here, I can't seem to get my arrow. There you go. if I put this map up, if you can see where the Nile River, or that is Egypt, or that is the African continent. To the right of that, where if you can see this arrow, you see what we now call Arabia. There are some geological scholars that argue that this Red Sea here at one time did not exist before the flood. They call that the development of this space where the Red Sea is called geological sedimentation. If you've ever poured water in dirt and the water began to overflow the dirt begins to weaken and you can develop a gully. Some scholars argue that because of the depth and the length of the rain of the 40 days of the Noahic flood, that this landmass separated. And if you look at the map, you can see that the Gihon River is right here where the arrow is. And then here's the Pishon, here's the Euphrates, and here is the Tigris. So wherever the Garden of Eden was, it was not in Europe, because Europe is way up here. And so just looking at the text geographically, we can see how some of the racist ideologies and the agendas of the early scholarship was used to support a notion of racism that does not exist in the scriptures. So that's the end of my talk. I still have 3 minutes and 41 seconds. So if you want me to continue with the Manifest Destiny answer, I can.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so you asked the question, what have been the effects of the notion of manifest destiny and the development in our nation? Well, the notion that God declared that white people would lead and transform the world, the new world, is what we call manifest destiny. In 1885, a newspaper editor by the name of John O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny in 1845, I'm sorry, to describe the essence of this mindset. It follows like this. The religious fervor spawned by the Second Great Awakening created another incentive for the drive to the West. Indeed, many settlers believed that God himself blessed the growth of the American nation, and the indigenous people, or First Nations people, were considered heathens. At the heart of manifest destiny was the pervasive belief in American culture and racial superiority. Indigenous peoples had long been perceived as inferior, and efforts to civilize them have been widespread since the days of John Smith and Miles Standish. Also, in this connection, or this idea of manifest destiny, is the notion that the Hispanics, who at one time ruled Texas, were also inferior and a backward group of people. So manifest destiny, by definition, is this notion that Europeans were given the right and the responsibility by God to conquer and lead the world, and peoples of color were inferior. And I still have 22 minutes.
That was fantastic. That was fantastic, Rick. Thank you so much. Please, if you have comments or questions for Rick, please place them in the chat box, and then we will return to those. And now I want to introduce Victoria Gibbs from CORE, Congregations Organizing for Racial Reconciliation. Victoria. You'll need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. I appreciate your correction on that title, because the marquee said racism reconciliation, but it is racial reconciliation. But we are continually evolving, so you will probably hear another name before long. So just anticipate that. I really appreciate the way Professor Rick set up what I wanted to say, because in light of all these racist ideologies and distortions about how race came on the set, it's really necessary to embrace the notion that we internalize some real mixed messages about who we are from an ethnic point of view. I liken it to the fact that if a child is raised in a home where parents are alcoholic or drug addicted or whatever the addictive substance could be, that child develops ways to be in light of that addiction. And oftentimes those ways to be aren't detected until very much late in life. And we've done a lot of research around this and come to the awareness that because we have been developed in a society with these false notions that are totally antithetical to what God said with regard to who we are, we've developed some ways to be, some ways to think, some ways to act and react around issues of race. So what CORE really works hard to do is give this historical revelation, both from the societal aspects and from the aspects of how these distortions came about in the church. We attempt to give evidence that we have developed two different ways of looking at race and racism. One is what we call internalized racial oppression, and this is the malady that's assigned to people of color. The other is internalized racial superiority. And what has happened is we've internalized some messages that even after we've come to an awareness that we have been falsely indoctrinated, because this has been a major part of our conditioning, we still act out on these behaviors. One of the examples that I use often is that an institution may come to a point of saying, we want to be anti-racist. We want a DEI department. We want to do better in this line of understanding than what we're doing. So what happens is the institutional heads will scout the country for a person that can come in, head up a department, and really change this organization from one way of thinking to the next. And lo and behold, 2, 3, 5 years later, that person of color that they scoured the country to get to come in to do this task finds themselves walking on a floor covered with marbles, tripping and falling all along the way, with a lot of covert action to diminish the work and the direction of that person of color. And we're pretty convinced that what has happened is that people in the organization have not dealt with internalized racial oppression and internalized racial superiority. So consequently, behaviors keep on happening in spite of the cognitive awareness that things need to be different. So what we do in CORE is have times where people of color move into a group and white folk move into another group, and there is a digging that happens with regard to how we were shaped, how we were misidentified with regard to our ethnicity, and how this misidentification has brought about some behavior that does not allow for good, cohesive team building that will actually change the institution. So we meet in these two different groups, and we're actually in the process of developing a third group so that there is a white group, a person, African-American group, and then the third group is, we're labeling it the group of the global majority, which would embrace biracial, Asian, Hispanic, people who aren't on either of the polar opposites of how our society sees ethnicity. So we break into these groups. We have a question or a situation or some kind of documentary that stimulates the conversation. We talk about what our internal responses are to the stimulus, and then we come back to compare what our personal collective findings are. So what we're doing is digging at the roots of what has really prompted these preconceived notions based upon false information. And it's not until we have really studied these preconceived notions that we possess that we're able to move this knowledge from our head to our heart. Because what we are agreed upon is that laws cannot change the maladies that we see in society. These changes have to come by way of the heart. So this is the major work of CORE, getting people to re-identify that ethnicity with regard to how we've been shaped over time from our early developmental years until present time. And I was not watching the clock as Pastor Rick was, so I'm not sure where I'm at with regard to my 10 minutes.
I think you're fine, Victoria, if you want to talk more about kind of the history of racism in the church.
Well, one of the things that we have a real good grasp on now is that the church was involved from the beginning. And I'm so thankful that there have been so many prolific writers that are bringing this to our attention, that from the time that Europe came to the States, the church was involved. And I started my awareness with this as I read Kendi's work in Stamped from the Beginning with regard to how this started as early as the 1500s. And it came and church leaders gravitated to this racialized identity, and it must have been a situation where money became the driving force. Even though I've read that this is the indication, I don't want to believe it at all times, but I land back in that space that in order to keep these institutions going, there had to be a way to promote this idea of white supremacy so that that could be the control factor. So as much as we don't want to accept it or believe it, the church has had a main force in making certain that white supremacy flourished, and it will continue to flourish. And it's my strong belief that not until people deny this and decide that they're going to go back to Genesis 1:26 and 27, that we're created in God's image, that we will even be able to begin to rectify this problem.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. Really appreciate your being here and for sharing the work that CORE is doing, as well as more perspective on our historical context. So thank you for that. And now I'll ask you to remute, and we'll introduce Gordon Wiersma from Hope Church, our third panelist.
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara. I'm really grateful for Momentum Center having this forum. I appreciate the work they do in our community. Thank you, Dr. Stevenson and Director Proctor Gibbs for what you've shared. I really appreciate your wisdom and hope to be able to build on that with what I share this evening. I can speak to you just from my own context, which is as a white Christian, cisgender, straight man. And we're in a culture where all of those identities for me carry privilege. It's a privilege which on the one hand is visible all around us in places of power, but it also has this strange way too, where my identities of privilege wear a kind of cloak of invisibility in our culture, which hides those identities in plain view by calling them normal or normative. And so that interplay of both the power and that subtle invisibility of privilege, I think it can bring to a forum that's called religion and racism, because Christian hegemony in our culture often tries to assert religion as being synonymous with Christianity. And so in such a culture, perhaps Christianity must be dealt with first for religion and racism, or at least white Christianity must be. And so I can speak to my own experience as a white Christian of coming to grips, of still trying to come to grips with religion and racism. I grew up in what would be considered a more progressive, liberal Christian subculture, tucked within a larger conservative Christian subculture. That's at least how I would describe my little niche in the Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The CRC is a very white conservative denomination, but much of my experience was lived in a conscious contrast to that white conservatism. I was raised in one of the few racially integrated CRC churches in downtown GR. I attended one of the few racially integrated CRC Christian schools. I learned to celebrate equality and multiculturalism, and I think that much of that was framed for me in the Reformed language of grace. Grace was this way from God that we could all get along, and that's what we should focus on. That really began to unravel for me about 5 years ago, which is when I first attended a Christian institutional space that was not a white space. I attended McCormick Seminary in Chicago to do some doctoral work, and it was deeply transformative for me. There I was taught by Black professors and read non-white theologians and had a cohort of Black colleagues, which gave me the tools both to relook at my own history and to look back further into Christian history. And as I did so, what really was the key insight for me was to realize that much of the history that I had learned was actually a history of whiteness. Whiteness is that worldview which invents and elevates white people racially, culturally, and morally in order to justify dominating others. And it does so with this insidiously brilliant justification that such domination is actually a moral imperative from God. This invention of whiteness emerged and coalesced in 16th century Western Europe, as we've heard referred to, and then it was imposed in this continent in systemic and epically violent ways. Whiteness was not something I had recognized much or at all before, but once you do see whiteness, it's daunting and enraging and shaming and depressing, and possibly, by God's grace, which I still do believe in, seeing whiteness can be transformative. And it has deeply impacted my sense of personal history and of broader Christian history. In coming to see whiteness, I realized that growing up, all the integrated spaces that I was in were actually still all white spaces. In my school growing up, nearly all the teachers and leaders were white. In my mostly white church in an all-Black neighborhood, there was mostly white leadership. We talked much about equality, but not much about structural racism. We handed out food for charity, but there was no talk of community organizing or economic justice, and I certainly never heard any questions raised about the police. My church was a place of a white space of power and priorities. Seeing whiteness, I had the realization that although I went to the CRC college, it truly never occurred to me to notice or wonder why there were virtually no students of color. I never noticed hardly ever reading Black or Hispanic authors, never discussing race or racism or racial justice. Seeing whiteness, I now look back 30 years to the progressive Princeton Seminary I attended and notice again, very few students of color, virtually no theologians of color to read, no mention of the racism endemic in the founders of the seminary. Seeing whiteness now, I realize I truly hadn't faced how it was that a Christian nation could be a cradle for slavery. Or if I did, I just blamed that on other bad Christians, but didn't look beyond slavery to the genocide of First Peoples, which was done with pervasive Christian theological conviction and blessing, at least white Christian conviction. Through seeing whiteness, I began to see that the country I love was also a place of lynching in white Christian communities, of systemic violence through the police carried out against Blacks and people of color throughout our country. As a country where Black World War II veterans were systematically excluded from benefits of the GI Bill, even as the prison industrial system was developed with a racist structure, all under the watch of a white Christian culture. And seeing whiteness led me to re-examine my Reformation roots too. I always drank the Kool-Aid that the Reformed theology was just about correcting the Catholics. And then it turned out we had to correct a lot of other Protestants too. The goal was always to have pure, true theology. But it turns out the dawn of the Reformation was in sync with the dawn of whiteness in Western Europe, and European Christianity went out into the world carrying white supremacy with it. Well, I still believe there is a powerful theology of grace that Reformed faith can offer towards justice today. For many centuries, Reformed Christian faith perpetuated an individualistic salvation that made it possible for white Christians not only to perpetuate racism while being Christian, but as a part of Christianity itself, with a white supremacy divine mandate that manifests destiny idea at the core of faith and nation. Whiteness at the core of Western Christianity is a broken and evil reality that I believe the white church is only beginning to come to grips with. And that's perhaps even mostly true for white progressive liberal Christians like me. Those white spaces I grew up in were full of many good-hearted people, but those spaces fell short in the capacity to see how whiteness in Christianity has itself been at the core of racism and injustice. We white liberals loved Dr. King when he talked about racial reconciliation, but we tuned him out when he talked about structural justice. And we didn't listen at all to Black theologians Thurman and Cone and West, and certainly didn't listen to Malcolm X and to many other voices beyond Christianity through whom God was speaking truth to whiteness. So let me pause. That's a lot to take in, I know. It's been a lot for me. But to help find a way forward, I want to share an information graphic from my esteemed colleague, Reverend Dr. Denise Kingdom Greer. She's an African-American pastor, theologian, and leader in my community, and her website, the First Corinthians Project, offers a profound way forward for us. She speaks first of the evocative concept of rehearsing history, rehearing history through the voices of people of color, exposing whiteness till a new narrative settles in us. And then bringing that narrative into our present story through repentance, through remembering the dismembered bodies of the past and present, and reminding our thoughts and actions to steer a path towards racial justice. So as a white Christian cisgender straight man, I feel called to take a lead in this work in my own way, to lead through listening to and centering the voices of people of color, to lead through learning about whiteness and white Christian complicity, to lead through following. As with my congregation, we're seeking to partner with leaders of color for justice initiative, to lead by committing to rehearsing and repenting and reminding, because there's so much more to uncover and relearn and rebuild. I still believe that through God's grace, even though there is often shame and anger in seeing whiteness, it also is a way to justice and abundance. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to more conversation and action towards racial justice.
Gordon, thank you so much for that powerful testimony. As somebody also raised in a liberal white church, I really appreciate your sharing and your insights.
Thank you, Barbara.
Let's open things up for Q&A. Please place any questions for any of our speakers into the chat box. I know we had a question or two come in before the chat. We also had a couple that were not related to our topic tonight, so we'll save those for when we are talking about those topics. But Mary Jane, do you have questions to pose to our speakers?
Yes, I have a couple. So the first one comes in two parts. So I'll pause and read them slow enough. What role has the American church played in the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration? So what role does the church play? And what would you encourage the church to do in response? This question is for everyone.
Okay, I'd like to start out if I can. I used to live in Grand Rapids, and one of the things that I learned early on about the community was that a lot of the church leaders did not connect with the community who were not church members. And so one of the ways I tried to reach out was I did a Bible study in a barbershop. And it was a barbershop where a lot of the people who got their hair cut there were maybe gang members or sold drugs or were people who normally didn't come to church. And as we started doing the study, we discovered that there were people who really wanted to know about God. They just didn't like the preachers, or they didn't like the churches because they didn't feel like they fit. Another way of reaching out is I also used to do a motorcycle ride-in. Every summer we had a worship service for bikers, and on the marquee, it would say Jesus rode a donkey and we ride Harleys. And we would invite, different bike clubs to worship. So I think we have to go beyond the walls. And sometimes we've got to be creative in reaching out to people who don't see Christianity the same way that we do, and yet are desirous of engaging themselves with a spiritual aspect of their existence, and they don't know how to get it because we can be so offensive when they don't fit into our boxes.
And I'd like to add to that, I've experienced so much denial from the white church that there is a systemic problem. There's been a conditioning to believe that this whole idea of racism is an individual thing. And this whole engagement one-on-one is a goal. Let's get some people of color in that we can be friends with, have over to dinner and do different social things. But as far as engaging the system of racism that's designed right now to just take our Black children and put them in a prison, there's a total denial that this is actively happening. And I don't even know if I would have considered this had I not watched it up close and personal in my own family. But there is a systemic gathering of power to take our Black men off the streets and put them into a place where they will not be able to make a contribution towards society. So that whole notion has to be addressed, that there's a system working.
Thank you, Rick and Victoria. I can add to that a bit with schools. I'm so much trying to bring the systemic issues in society to say those are a part of religious response of Christianity. Victoria speaks so well of systemic things. Schooling, money for schooling, that's a national systemic issue, and it has been white Christian communities that often have been at the heart of white flight from areas that people of color come into, and that have supported inequitable school funding through taxation. People say, what can I do? What can I do about racism? Well, what if the white church raised up and said, let's change the funding system so that there is equal funding for everyone? It's really the white church that I'm speaking to. We have this individualistic idea of being part of a church and then not seeing the impact that has on society, that all of these injustices have been perpetuated in a white Christian culture. What can we do? Let's talk about taxes. Let's talk about money for education. Let's throw money at the problem. White people like to talk about not throwing money at the problem. I'll tell you, let's throw money at education and see what happens in communities where there is that prison to pipeline system. These are the kind of things that we need to start seeing as Christian religious issues rather than setting it aside and allowing the racist system that's been in place to continue to perpetuate white privilege.
Thank you. I have another question. What might be your hopes for the future of anti-racism? Gordon, why don't you start if you're willing?
I think that for me, it's trying to as a white Christian leader, express to my congregation, to my cohort, to my community, that to face the history, to face what's happened, it isn't a path of shame and of depression. It's very difficult. It's very hard to do, but it's a path of abundance. We are all missing out on something by the structures of inequity and the internalized things that Director Gibbs has spoken of, the theological constricts that Dr. Stevenson spoke of. We are diminished, and when I start to see the incredible material that's out there that can help us relearn and then take a different path forward, I think there's great possibility there. But it's going to take a real reckoning of the white church. And I think of a lot of white progressives of saying that much of the sort of this multicultural approach without addressing systemic issues, that doesn't cut it. We have to get to the systemic things too, and that's the real path to abundance.
And I'm gonna
go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Quickly add to that as white progressives or white churches come into this understanding, there has to be a desire to look at the individual internalized issues or contributions that they've made.
Yeah.
What I've watched over my years of being involved in the white institution is that there are many white people who have a heart for justice, who want to do the right thing, but they come in with this savior mentality, or I've got the answers and I know what you need. And it is such a big turnoff. And that internalized message that they operate out of, and there's a list of internalized messages that go on. That's not the only one, but that has to be challenged down the path of understanding only God Almighty can actually change the heart in a way that will enable white folk to walk in tandem with people of color, who would be able to see a person of color in the lead, giving directions, giving an agenda that they're willing to follow, even if they don't understand it, even though they may not have written the script, but to level the playing field as a result of doing that internalized work, realizing that we're all created in God's image and that we can come together and do a tandem journey to cut the head off this beast that society has unleashed on us.
So if I can add a little bit to this conversation, I think the first thing we have to take into account that there's a psychological impact of racism, not only on Black people, but white people as well. And white people have been socialized in a racialized framework to believe that they are superior. And so what I try to do is what I've done recently. I just gave a paper at Vanderbilt entitled Racism as a Public Health Issue. I kind of look at racism as COVID-19. So COVID-19 has killed millions and millions of people, and so has racism. COVID-19 is asymptomatic. You can have it, not know it, and so is racism. COVID-19 has made it very clear to us that Black and brown people suffer more than white people in America, and so has racism. And so I think that we have a framework that we can look at that demonstrates that racism is not just about systems, and it is, but it's a disease that needs to be healed. And the only way you can heal it is to wear a mask. And there are people who don't want to wear a mask. Well, what's the mask? The mask is love. The mask is equality. The mask is commitment. The mask is the willingness to support someone that you don't know. And until we get to that space, and then the other part, the mask is truth. We're having these major conversations about critical race theory, and people are lying about it and arguing that what critical race theory is teaching white kids to hate themselves, and that all white people are racist. That is not what critical race theory is. Critical race theory, as a matter of fact, if you know anything about it, you won't even get engaged into critical race theory in law school until your second year. So if you have a junior high school kid who is studying critical race theory, you have a genius on your hand. But the key to critical race theory is access to primary sources. And in my earlier conversation, I mentioned the importance of looking at original text. That's what critical race theory does. Critical race theory takes us to the original text, and we learn what the founding fathers and leaders of this country were saying about Black and brown and indigenous people. And then you get to the truth of how racism became systemic.
Thank you. Your answer, Dr. Stevenson, is a good segue into the next question. Love is a significant tenet of Christianity, agape love, and it's reflected in both the first and the second commandment, love God and love your neighbor. Why isn't agape enough for the Christian church to be anti-racist?
I'd like to respond to that because that was something that I had to really sort through as I came into this anti-racism work. And the reason I had to sort through it is because I have been thoroughly indoctrinated in the ways of the Christian school system. I came into the Christian school system here in Grand Rapids in 6th grade, and I was in that system until I graduated from high school. And I would be the first to say that I experienced a lot of love, a lot of acceptance, a lot of we're glad that you're here. But I cannot help but wonder how that message would have came forward had there been 10 of me in this setting, if the dynamics would have changed. And what I've come to understand that with all the love that was poured out on me during my school years, none of that enabled me to get a job, enabled me to protect my sons from the evil acts of racism that they encountered. So it's one thing to have a feeling about somebody, and it's another thing to understand that there is a system at work that is designed to get rid of me.
Thank you. Would anyone else care to comment?
Well, agape love is unconditional. It means that you will look out for the other person's best interests, whether they respond to you positively or not. In Luke chapter 10, there's a scholar who asked Jesus, what do I have to do to gain eternal life? Now, what's interesting about the text is Luke begins by saying he asked the question to test him. In other words, he really didn't care. And I think that sometimes when we have this question, well, what can I do to really overcome racism? It's a test. It's not as much as a person really trying to figure out what to do as it is they're just trying to engage in the conversation for the sake of engagement. But Jesus is pretty interesting because he doesn't answer him. What he says to him is this. He says, how do you read the text? And the man says, love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your soul, your neighbor, yourself. And then Jesus says, go do likewise. And then the man says, well, who is my neighbor? And that's where we get the Good Samaritan, which is actually an oxymoron. Here's the deal. If you're really going to love someone, you got to be able to love that person who you know doesn't like you. Because the whole narrative of the Good Samaritan is about a man who is being hated by the very person he's trying to help. Because the person who is sick and beaten up on the road is a Jew. That would be like me helping someone who was a KKK member. So in other words, if we're really going to understand how this agape love works, it's beyond just a feeling or an emotion. It is the ability and the willingness to deal with and accept and work on behalf of someone else that you know hates your guts.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. And one more technical question I'm going to give to you, please. Someone is asking, when those panelists are referring to the church, is it to a specific denomination or the Christian religion in general?
When I refer to the church, I'm talking about the body of Christ, both black and white. And I'll tell you why. I'm glad you asked the question. I just returned from giving a presentation at Morehouse College, and I saw a person from Grand Rapids who was at this conference. And I didn't remember who he was initially, but his wife reminded me. And the way we met, I was doing a Bible study in Grand Rapids. I pulled up on my motorcycle and it was kind of warm. So I had my arms out, suns out, guns out, I had my locks out. And this guy begins to talk about me negatively to some other people. And then I go into the Bible study and I end up doing the Bible study. And he came out afterwards and apologized to me because one, he was blessed by what God said through me that day, but two, he shouldn't have taken that step of being negating. And my point is this: it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a black church or the white church, all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. We have to be clear that there are people in the body of Christ, no matter what your background is, that are still very negative cross-culturally and cross-genderally. So we have to deal with those issues internally, whether it's black or white. So I tend to speak of the church as the body of Christ, which is inclusive of everyone who calls on the name of Jesus.
Can I speak to that?
Certainly, and then we'll wrap up. So please, Gordon.
I think Dr. Stevenson has the standing to do that, to speak to the whole church. I feel called in many ways now to examine and speak to the white church because of the need to face a history that hasn't often been there. And it connects, I think, to what we're talking to about love. Director Gibbs and Dr. Stevenson have spoken so powerfully, but I'm coming from a history where I wonder, maybe love has been used, but I'm not sure the premise of the question, because a lot of the theological work I've been doing is to shift from an individualistic to a community idea of salvation. What white Christian theology allowed is to have white priests, pastors, baptize slaves as they were going on to a boat, basically saying God loves you, right? And then sending them to slavery. That I need to use some different words then, if that's what love has meant in my white Christian history, right? I need to start talking about justice, because there's just no way that love can go together with someone being marched onto a slave ship and saying that goes together. So given my context, I need to find some new words, some new things that break us out of this individualistic silo that has allowed love to go side by side with injustice. That's what I'm called to try to find new language, new paths to do.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wiersma. I'm going to turn this back over to Barbara.
Thank you so much. Thank you for facilitating that, Mary Jane. Thank you for our panelists. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we will email those to our panelists and ask for their responses in the next 24 hours so we can include that in the packet that you'll receive. So please don't stop asking questions if new ones have come into your mind. But we are going to move on now to our small group conversations. That conversation time always goes so quickly. Want to invite you to mute your mics again, and then I'll call on the facilitator of each of the rooms. And what we'd like to hear is one action suggestion that came out of your room, one suggestion for an action. And my apologies ahead of time to Tyra. Group 5 ended up with just a couple people, so I moved everybody around. So thank you for being willing to facilitate. We'll start with Group 1. Elliot, one suggestion for an action.
Gosh, I mean, I had the benefit of a really great group, so I feel bad abbreviating it to one suggestion. But I will say, Gordon and Wanda both really touched on this, but A, digging to the root of something, but B, forcing people to say no to DEI. So forcing somebody to say like, no, I don't think this is a problem, instead of just going around in vagaries saying like, well, harumph, I don't really think this is, like actually having like the full truthful conversation, being comfortable speaking the truth to somebody and gauging the response. So I think that was a huge suggestion, just being brave enough to have an open conversation about this stuff in true terms.
Thank you, Elliot. And yeah, just a note for everybody, although we're just asking for one action being reported out right now, the facilitators have taken notes of all of the suggestions, and those will be coming to the Anti-Racism Task Force to review tomorrow. So we'll include all of that in that conversation. We just limit this because of time. How about group 2, Mary?
Hi. Yes, get away from the idea of inviting people from Muskegon Heights down to the Tri-Cities area, as somehow this is going to be this great solution to the problem of racism. And maybe we need to address the whole church's need to deconstruct the systemic issue.
Thank you, Mary, and group 2. How about group 3, Emily? Are you there, Emily? Is there somebody from?
Emily might have gotten moved to our group.
Oh, okay.
And so I think maybe group 3 was disbanded.
Oh, okay. Well, is there anybody here that was in 3? All right. How about Monica, group 4?
It was a super meaty conversation. So I'm going to distill it down to knowing that Christianity was used as an excuse for imperialism and this idea of white supremacy, superiority, to constantly be looking back at how might we each be perpetuating those concepts of white superiority and developing a listening ear by listening, further educating.
Thank you, Monica, and group 4. How about group 6, Holly?
Yeah, another great conversation. Thank you, Juliet, Judy, and we were lucky enough to have Dr. Stevenson with us. Our takeaway is do what you can to become a white ally, keep reading, and go to a long talk about the uncomfortable truth to learn how you can interrupt racism in your everyday life.
Excellent. How about group 7, Mary Jane?
So we're sticking with the theme. Ask yourself what you can do, and then find the bravery and the courage to do it, because everyone has their niche. And right along with that, in Grand Haven and in the Tri-Cities, acknowledge people, say hello, so that they know that we're a welcoming community, or that we're moving more towards being a welcoming community. So notice people.
Thank you. Excellent. How about group 8, Carrie? Are you there, Carrie?
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute. Having leaders in our community and church leaders get together and discuss the big systemic issues, and also gathering together, even though I know it's more building relationships, but and gathering together and getting to know each other.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. How about group 9, Carolyn?
Yeah, really getting quiet with God and ask some serious questions about what did I do to participate in this thought, by word, by deeds, by enabling, by acceptance, and to get a willingness to accept your part, and that brings it to your heart. That's what brings it to your heart, where you can truly make the change and start to go out and be an advocate.
Yeah, thank you. How about Greg in group 10?
Yeah, Barbara, I would think our group takeaway was probably the benefit of conversation, like the ones we're having tonight is action. And we also did reference, several members referenced a long talk and how important this is a part of the journey.
Fantastic. Thank you, Greg in group 10. How about Jane in group 11?
Well, we were grateful Tyra got bumped because she came to our group, so it was lovely having her. Just in reference to our question number one, I wanted to address the group was just very complimentary of the passion of the panelists, and that they are willing to talk about change, seeing change, what to do, and just their honesty and openness about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Were there any facilitators that were missed? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for that conversation, for your reporting out. Facilitators, please go ahead and take a picture or paste your notes and send those ahead so we can review those tomorrow. We have some poll questions now, and we'll start with our post-meeting poll. Which asks again, so having had this conversation, does that shift your perspective at all on how present racism is in our community? Not at all, minimally, somewhat, regularly, or systemically. And how comfortable are you talking about race? The same, more comfortable, or less comfortable than when we started this conversation? You just take a moment to answer those questions. And we're at 95%. So just a couple more. Close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let me share the results this time. There's still some folks in the conversation that aren't seeing racism present in the community, but a higher shift toward the always. And in terms of feeling comfortable, we have 66% of the people feeling more comfortable talking about race and racism than when we started. Next question is an evaluation question. How helpful was this town hall? Not at all. Is it showing up?
We're not seeing it, Barbara.
Not yet. Up. It's letting me share results, but not the question. Let me try another one.
It was for a second, Barbara.
It was
disappeared.
Okay, well, we'll come back. We'll try it again. Here's a question about another town hall. Would you be interested in participating in additional town halls? And if so, what topics would you like to see addressed? So yes or no, you'd be interested. And then the possible options include organizations that are addressing racism, the historical instances of racism in the Tri-Cities, local government actions and reactions, local businesses and the economics of race, implicit bias, white privilege, racism and healthcare, racism and mental health care, racism and the justice system. And you can choose as many of those as you like. This is how we really decide the order that we're going to talk about topics of race. As we entered our second season, religion and racism had the highest marks. So that's why we started here. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer this. And again, make sure you hit the submit button after you choose your answers. And I'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let me show you the results. 100% are interested in continuing these conversations. And it looks like the highest ratings here are for organizations that are addressing racism and local government responses. So that's really helpful. Thank you for that. Let's try that evaluation question again. Is it showing now? It's still.
No,
nope.
It is not yet.
That's interesting. We're going to try action then. What actions are you willing to take now, having experienced the town hall? Read or listen or watch documentaries to learn more, engage in more conversations, engage in conversations with people who are not the same race as you, participate in demonstrations, support DEI initiatives at the school, at schools, attend implicit bias training, get involved in local government, donate to groups working for racial justice, join the community book club on race and racism, invite other people to the series of town hall meetings. So any of those that you're willing to do, please check and submit. And talk definitely is an action, and we always want to invite the next step. All right, I'm going to close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here are the results. 84% engage in more conversations about race and racism, and 82% engage in conversations with people of a different race are the two highest. And just scrolling that for you to see. And we're going to take one more, we're going to try one more time for the evaluation. No idea. Okay, let's try this. Relaunch. There. Is that working? Awesome.
Yep.
So how helpful was this town hall? Not at all helpful? Made you more aware? Motivated you to take action, or convinced you to become or continue as a leader? Okay. Oops, I'll run it for a couple more seconds. A few more people still answering. And I'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll share the results. One person didn't find it helpful, so I want to thank that person for staying on board throughout the conversation. I think it's a particular demonstration of maturity and a willingness to engage when you're not finding it personally helpful. So thank you for continuing to be in conversation. 45% said more aware, 42% motivated to action, and 53% becoming or continuing as a leader. So that's really helpful information for us to have. Next thing I want to mention are just those next steps. As I said, we will be sending all of the participants this recording, the slides, any materials, the chat, basically the evening in a package we will send out to everybody who participated. We will ask our panelists to answer any remaining questions that were in chat that they didn't get a chance to answer. And then we'll be reviewing your feedback and your action items at our anti-racism meeting tomorrow. Next steps that you can take are you can go to the Anti-Racism Task Force page at the Momentum Center, click on that reflect button, and share your thoughts about the town hall tonight. The polling questions don't give us a lot of latitude. They're only answer yes or no kind of questions. This would give you a chance to really share your reflections. Report in action. You've said that there are things you're willing to do. Once you've done them, please report so that we can share that with each other and support each other in our work. And then that form to support the Ottawa County DEI initiatives is also available right on that same page. Also, mark your calendar now for the next town hall. We are changing the dates for November and December because the fourth Monday falls right in the middle of holidays, and we don't want people to not be able to participate because of holiday gatherings. So we'll be meeting the second Monday instead of the fourth in November and December, which means we'll be meeting Monday, November 8th, just a couple of weeks away. And the topic will be racism in the church today. Our panelists will include Henry Church from I Am Academy, Denise Greer, who Gordon Wiersma referenced today, 1 Corinthians 13 project, and Brian Berghoff from Holland UCC. So please check your calendar. We'll get that registration link out so that you can sign up. And I also want to invite you to the free dinner and movie night at the Momentum Center. We're aligning our movie next month with our topic of racism in the church. So we'll be watching the documentary White Savior. So invite you to be present for that, November 12th, free dinner at 5, movie at 6, and that takes place at the Momentum Center in Grand Haven, open and free to everyone.
Hey, Barbara.
Yeah.
Just with your publicity, it's Henry Cherry. I don't know if you've sent that out yet. It's not
I
Henry
have
Church.
not.
It's
Oh.
Henry Cherry. Yeah.
Huh. Thank you so much for catching that for
You
me,
bet.
Gordon. I
Yeah,
will
you
make
bet.
that change. And you're just in time because no, it has not been sent.
Yeah, they're great folks, great organization. So
Yes, really looking forward to those speakers. And tonight, a huge thanks and shout out to our panelists, to Rick, Victoria, Gordon. The three of you were amazing. I heard comments about, this being some of the meatiest material we've been able to cover in our town halls. So very, very grateful for your contributions to that. And also thank you to our task force and to all the individuals who played roles here today, all of our facilitators, as well as Joanne, who helped me with timing, Brian, who ran security, Holly, who was recording the poll results, Mary Jane for Q&A, and all of you just for being here, for being part of the conversation. I believe things happen relationally and relationships start with conversations. So thank you so much, every one of you. Until November 8th, the divine in me recognizes and bows to the divine in you. Namaste.